So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to start. I would like to wish you all welcome to today's dissertation when Oskar Lagnelöv is defending his thesis with the title Electric Autonomous Tractors in Swedish Agriculture. My name is Åke Nordberg. I'm Associate Professor at the Department of Energy and Technology here at the SLU in Uppsala, and I have been appointed by the faculty to share this public defense. And I also like to introduce some also very important persons in order to make a dissertation work. I will first start with the opponent, which is Professor James Lowenberg-DeBoer, coming from Harper Adams University, Newport, UK. Then we have the evaluation committee, and I will start with Dr. Linda Agervik Ellingsen from the Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, Norway. We also have Professor Vitalis Osachuks from Latvia University of Life Science and Technology in Jelgava in Latvia. We have Professor Göran Lindberg from the Division of Applied Electrochemistry at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, in Stockholm. And we also have a deputy or a reserve in the evaluation committee, Professor Girma Gebresembet from the Department of Energy and Technology here at the SLU in Uppsala. I would like to wish you all very welcome. I also would like to present the supervisor group with the main supervisor, Per-Anders Hansson, sitting up there. And we have also the co-supervisors, Dr. Gunnar Larsson, also up there, sorry, and Dr. Anders Lars-Olle, sitting there. And before going to the procedure, I've been informed that I have obliged to inform you that this dissertation, it will be recorded through the webinar. And that will be used then for archiving this special event, but also used in our information channels where you will need a password to get access to it. So then everybody knows that. So coming to the procedure, we start with Oskar will present for about 30 minutes about his work. After that, the word will be given to the opponent, who will then initiate a more detailed discussion on the scientific content and also put the work into a scientific context. After that, the floor will be given to the evaluation committee to bring up further questions or issues you like to discuss or highlight in relation to the thesis. After that, the floor is open for questions from the audience. Thereafter, this session will be closed. However, based on experience, we will also have a break, and that will be approximately at 2:30. So giving you a possibility to stretch your leg and refresh yourself. And then we will continue 10 minutes after exactly from where we ended before the break. Right. So, Oskar, before we start, I would like to ask you, do you have anything you would like to add or comment in relation to your published thesis?
Yes, I have an errata for my thesis, right next to the pile of theses. That's what I'd like to add.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that said, let's go. The stage is yours, Oskar.
Thank you for that introduction, Åke. I'd also like to extend a welcome and a thank you to my opponent and my examining committee. And I would also like to thank my supervisor group for their supervision during my project. My name is Oskar Lagnelöv, and I'm here today to defend my thesis titled Electric Autonomous Tractors in Swedish Agriculture. This project has been funded by the Swedish Energy Agency, their Stand Up for Energy program, and Mistra Food Futures. So let's get into some background. Agriculture is currently facing some challenges in keeping up with the growing global population. In November last year, we exceeded 8 billion people on this planet, and we are still growing. And to keep up with this production, we have gone through several decades of intense mechanization and intensification of agricultural production. From the 1960s, we have increased the average cereal yield with 200%, so doubling it. And the available caloric supply per person has been increased by a third, meaning less prevalence of malnutrition. We've also managed to do this with less people in the agricultural sector. In Sweden, in 1960, about 10% of the population worked in agriculture. Today, it's 1.6%, and it might even be hard to find skilled labor for the sector. But this increased production and efficiency has come at a cost. Since the 1960s, the axle load of tractors in average have increased 270%, from 1.5 tons to 4 tons. We've also experienced increased diesel use and use of inorganic fertilizers. All of this have resulted in a higher greenhouse gas emission and climate impact, with, in 2017, roughly 23% of the global greenhouse gas emissions originating in the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors. And climate change, as you all know, is a big problem. According to the IPCC, we don't have much remaining emissions capacity if we are to meet our goal of keeping pre-industrial warming to 1.5 degrees. They estimate we have 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions left. For 2 degrees, 1150. But our emission rate is quite high and is still increasing. In 2019, we emitted between 50 and 60 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, meaning that we have less than 10 years to reverse this trend. So the clock is ticking and change is needed in all sectors, but one sector specifically that is very reliant on fossil fuel is transport. We have agricultural machinery that constitutes about 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, which is not the biggest part, but a part that, among others, need addressing. And there is a strong political mandate in this, with the EU wanting to be fossil-free or climate neutral in 2050, with similar goals in Sweden, and the Swedish government aiming to be having fossil-free vehicle fleet in 2030, which is quite soon. And there are many ways to reach this, but the one I have focused on in my research is vehicle electrification. And why have I chosen electrification? Well, according to IPCC, electricity has the highest reduction potential among alternative fuels for vehicles, meaning the emission potential reduction is high. It also gives some driveline and motor benefits, a higher overall efficiency, more efficient fuel use, reduced maintenance, and good controllability and torque are all important factors, especially for agriculture. And one of the main thresholds so far has been the price of electric vehicles. And during the last decade, the price of batteries for electric vehicles has been reduced by roughly 90%, meaning it has never been as affordable to invest in agricultural or electric vehicles, which is why we see this being proposed as a solution in several sectors. Going for electricity also allows us to have a very flexible production, since electricity can be produced almost anywhere and from a variety of sources, meaning that the farmer himself could produce his own electricity for his tractors, which would make him more resilient and less dependent on external factors. But despite all of these benefits, field machinery in agriculture is not usually electrified, even though we see on-road vehicles and other type of industry vehicles being electrified. So let's dive into why that is. Here you can see a couple of modern sources discussing the problem, talking about how the intense and complex tasks we do in agriculture is a hard match for electric vehicles, how the electric capacity of a battery only allows us to do a few hours of operation at a time, which is too short. Also, that the long time to recharge and the low durability of batteries hinders a market introduction. and taking significant share of the market. The main takeaway of this is that making the tractors of today just electric won't work. To make it feasible, we need additional technology. And the one I've chosen to explore is autonomous or self-driving vehicles. And autonomy is quite a good fit for agriculture. We have very repetitive and predictable tasks that we can schedule way in advance, which is really good when we are laying out a plan in a computer. So it's very fitting in that way. We also have simpler environments and geometries compared to other autonomous sectors. For example, compare going around a square field in predetermined paths to driving in a busy downtown area in rush hour. And you can see that agriculture has less problems to deal with there. There's also currently some degree of autonomy already existing in agriculture, with controlled traffic farming, GPS steering, headland turn assistance being quite common, and also a lot of other sensors being used for precision agriculture. So the technological leap from where we are today to self-driving vehicles is not that high or not that far. However, in my research, we have assumed quite a high level of autonomy. You might have seen this scale on the side here, which is the SAE or BUST scale of self-driving vehicles, where 0 to 2 is manned operation with some kind of driver assistance, and 3 to 5 is various levels of autonomous operation, with 4 and 5 being very independent and require a low degree of operator oversight. Level 3, where 2 and 3 is what you hear when people talk about self-driving vehicles today. 2 and 3. So 3 is where the vehicle itself can operate in very limited settings. We still require an operator, but the amount we need an operator to be present and working with the vehicle is heavily reduced. But we still need an operator in more of an overseer capacity. So we have these two systems that we're looking at, where we've already discussed the benefits of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles giving us good economic potential, the ability to work around the clock if ideal circumstances exist, very high precision, and the ability to divide the weight of a heavy tractor into multiple vehicles. They also come with their downsides, with the electric vehicle mainly having low energy carrying capacity, meaning that we can only work a short time in the field before we need to refuel. So either we have frequent refuelings or very heavy vehicles. The autonomous system is a legally and technically complex system, which might be a problem for market introduction, and it confers no emission reduction by itself. But when we combine these effects or these technologies, we get synergetic effects, meaning that a lot of the negatives can be reduced or eliminated while keeping the benefits of both systems. If we have to refuel often, that's less of a problem if you don't have to pay a driver for being idle. If we need to refuel or only work a little bit per tank, that's less of a problem if we have 24 hours to work per day instead of 10 or 8. And if we have heavy vehicles, it's less of a problem if we can divide it up on several different vehicles. So these are just a few of the synergetic effects we can get by combining these two systems. So as you might have guessed, my research encompasses electrification, autonomy, and agriculture. And all of these fields are well researched and well understood, while the combination of them is not. And that's where I've tried to apply my research. And using simulation and system analysis, I'm trying to answer the following questions. Can simulated battery electric tractors provide comparable work rate to diesel tractors? Can they reduce the environmental impact? Can they do so while being economically competitive to diesel tractors? And what are the important technology choices, and can those be optimized for Swedish agriculture? In general, this boils down to the following question. Can electric autonomous tractors replace diesel tractors? So now that we have the questions, we can see that they have resulted in several publications. On the left-hand side here, 4 of these are already published and 1 is soon to be sent for publishing. On the right-hand side, you can see how these papers connect, what kind of system level they are exploring, and what effect they are investigating. So now that we have the questions down, let's move on to methods. Since practical field test in this is difficult and expensive, we have elected to do simulation instead. And for this, I've created 3 separate models. A discrete event simulation model, where I simulate all the field work on the farm, the economic model for calculating cost, and an LCA model for calculating environmental impact. We will bring this with us. You can see it on the right-hand side here. And this will follow us through a presentation, so we can see what part of the model we're looking at right now. But first, let's talk about scenario inputs. Because for a system like this, we have almost unlimited possibilities in what we want to explore and research. So we have to nail down a few things about the scenario. So we elected to choose to focus on a farm here in Uppsala in Sweden that grows grains on 200 hectares, equally divided on barley, oats, winter wheat, and spring wheat. And we do this with a conventional cropping system. We have also included the clay-rich soil you can find in this region and the weather pattern over here, simulating up to 30 years of weather to both get a good data set for our system analysis and also to normalize the weather effects over these years. And the system we are comparing is basically a conventional system, you can see on the bottom left here, with a heavy vehicle, 250 kilowatts of engine power, running on diesel and being manned 10 hours per day, every day. This is in contrast to the 2 smaller battery electric vehicles that we are investigating, with self-driving operation 24 hours a day and a smaller motor power. And arriving at this type of scenario took some thoughts and some simulation. So I will walk you through my process in reaching this conclusion. If we take a diesel tractor to start, we have a good amount of active time that the driver is available. Most of this is spent working. And at the end of the shift, the driver drives back home to the farm, refuels, and then rests. This gives us the baseline work rate used by conventional tractors today. If we make this system electric, we have the same amount of active hours per day, but less of this is spent working, and more of it is spent recharging and transporting the vehicle. So the work rate is lowered. If we make this system autonomous on top of that, we see that we have many more active hours per day. We have a longer working period, and we can spend more of the day working. But a lot of time is still spent with transporting and recharging. So the work rate, even though we have a lot more working hours, is comparable to the conventional system. We solved this by introducing a battery swapping or battery exchanging system, meaning that each tractor has several battery packs. So you can come into the farm, remove an empty battery pack, and provide the tractor with a freshly charged one. The tractor can return to work and cut down on the charging time quite drastically. So this gave us lower charging periods and a higher work rate, and ended up being the system that we're currently using. With that understood, we step into the discrete event simulation model. It's a model I built in MATLAB with its various toolboxes, where the discrete event part means that we're following an agent, in this case the tractor, during its work, and the kind of events it encounters decides on how it's going to progress. So it gives a more realistic simulation type. It's also a dynamic system working over one full year. And here we define the vehicle, we define the environment, we define the fields that we're working on. We also have modules for local energy storage and soil compaction. And the vehicles we chose for the alternative scenario was smaller vehicles with a 50 kilowatt engine power or motor power, chargers of 50 kilowatts, and an energy content of 100 kilowatt hour per battery, and 2 batteries per tractor. The model itself works a bit in a circle, where the tractor first asks, is this a good time to work? Is it working season? Is the weather good? Are the fields dry? And if they need a driver, is the driver available? If yes, they go into operation decision, meaning do the field I'm currently looking at need the operation I'm doing? Does barley field number 1 require cultivation? If no, does spring wheat field number 1 require cultivation? When the tractor finds a work that needs doing, it transports to the field, performs that work until they need to go back to refuel, or the field work is done. They go back to the farm, refuel some energy, and change implement if needed, and then they repeat until all the fields have had all the necessary required operations done on them. In a model like this, we can track almost any variable or parameter, but the main ones we chose to focus on were energy use, number of refuelings or cycles, time required for all the operations. These inputs and outputs were then further used in the economic and LCA model, so that for each scenario we had performance, economy, and environmental impact with the same parameters. And some fun facts. During my PhD, I estimate I've done 500,000 simulations. They take roughly 1 minute a piece, which means I spent a full year of simulation time. Considering it also took me 2 years to build this model, if you wonder what a PhD does on their day job, you have an indication. Okay, I mentioned we had a module for soil compaction. By splitting the weight into separate multiple vehicles, we aim to avoid further soil compaction. The ground is still going to be normally compacted, but we wanted to avoid further soil compaction. And there's an entire research field about soil compaction, so we included just a few effects that were impactful and could be modeled in our model. Increased fuel use for field work, decreased hydraulic conductivity, meaning how easy it is for water to go through the soil, to drain through the soil, and decreased yield. The economic model worked on 2 legs. First, the investment annuity, basically meaning that you took the investment cost and divvy it up over the lifetime. And then the operational cost, where you can see down here, the main one, fuels, maintenance, operator cost, and so on. We also included some non-standard costs. For example, timeliness, the cost of having non-perfect establishment of your crops, or doing things in a non-perfect time. Soil compaction costs and battery aging costs were also included. We included the establishment of infrastructure, but only for the electric case. We based this on that I've never seen a farm with a charger, but I've seen every farm with a diesel tank. So we assumed that diesel tanks were available, but the electric charging system needed to be invested in. You can also see a simplified graph here. To assess the environmental impact, we performed an LCA, where we chose to do it by the ISO standard and to do a consequential, process-driven LCA. We included the entire life cycle from material extraction, manufacturing, use phase, end of life, so cradle to grave. And we did this for the tractor, the infrastructure, the batteries, and the fuel if needed. It's good to note here that we focused on the tractor. So some of the cost and environmental impacts of other things like harvest, housing, insurance, seeds, implement were assumed similar and therefore omitted from the publications. I have calculated on it, but it's not published. We then took the emissions from this life cycle and did an impact assessment according to the recipe methodology, where we took the emissions and made them into impact categories, where global warming potential or climate impact is one of them. The ones in the full box here are the ones that are commonly used in agricultural or battery electric vehicle LCAs. So they were provided as a separate result, while the ones in the checkered box here were not provided as a separate result, but all of these 18 categories were included when calculating damage categories. So all of these were converted into these 3 damage categories and further into a single score, which simplified is the total environmental impact. So if you want just one number, that's the number. We also chose the functional units of 1 arable hectare worked per year or 1 kilo of grain produced. We chose 2 different ones to be able to include things like yield loss easier and for ease of comparison. So now that we have talked a bit about the methods, let's go into the results of all these simulations. One of the main points is the battery. And batteries gets worse with age and use, experiencing something called capacity fade, a reduction in the amount of energy they can store, which usually is measured as a percentage of their original capacity. This is important to include in analyses, both for performance and economy. So we partnered with Uppsala University and their Ångström Advanced Battery Center to simulate this capacity fade over time, or more specifically, over use with the cycles. We omitted calendar aging as use for this kind of batteries would be more impactful. We did this for 4 different charging rates or charging speeds, where 1C is a speed where you would charge or discharge your battery in 1 hour. 4C means you would charge or discharge it 4 times in an hour. And C over 10 means it would take 10 hours to charge or discharge the battery. So slower, faster. We then fit this by a 3rd-degree polynomial, and I put it into the discrete event simulation model as a trigger event. You can see here how the model handles the dynamic capacity fade of the batteries, meaning the battery holds less and less energy until it reached 80%, at which it was replaced. And then you can see here after 5 years, we get a new battery and then it decreases again. This happened for different points for different charging rates, and the slower charging rates maintained a high battery lifetime. Another main result from the DS model was the energy use, with the electric seen here in green and the diesel ones seen here in blue, with the soil compaction effects seen in diagonals. As you can see, we have 2 different diesel values here. This is because one of them are simulated values that we calculated using bottom-up equations, but these have been reported as overstating the energy use. So we also validated it with field tests that had been done here in Uppsala by GTI. Very good results, by the way. You can also here see literature values from other sources that is comparable, so we get an idea of where we should be. The main takeaway is that going electric increased or reduced the energy use by 45 to 75%. Another main result was the scheduling or the timing of different operations. And here you can see at what time different operations were completed on the fields, with the gray boxes being the recommended sowing window in Swedish agriculture. As you can see, the electric was slightly faster in work rate, needing only 70 active days to complete the entire year's worth of operations, while the conventional system needed 97. The time-critical spring period was completed in 35 days by the electric and 48 by the diesel one. Both of them landed before the recommended sowing window, so the main negatives were avoided. We can also see that even though the electric vehicle was faster in many regards, the reduction of improvement could be seen in the heavier soil work. So harrowing, cultivating, and plowing were either slower or just slightly faster than the diesel case, where other operations would be a lot faster. So it struggled a bit with the heavier operations. How they spent the time was also a bit different, with the electric case spending more time in transport and charging, 18% of their time to be exact, while it was 3% for the diesel case. However, the main source of non-productive time for the conventional system, driver rest, was almost eliminated by going autonomous. We have weather as a big part here, but that's just a fact of life in agriculture. It's hard to predict, to work against the weather. And they had roughly equal amount of time spent here. So how they spent their time was a bit different. We also saw that having a balanced system was important here. You couldn't just increase the battery or the charger size and solve all your problems. If you increased the battery, you could work for longer, but then you need to recharge for longer and introduced queues to the system, meaning you had some trade-offs. The same was seen with the vehicle power. If we increase that, we can work faster, but then we drain the battery faster and need to refuel more often. So everything was trade-offs, and we needed to optimize the system as a whole and not as each component in turn. And a balanced approach was what worked best. Looking at the costs of this, we can see that there are a few general trends here, as you can see by these arrows. By making the system electric, we reduced the fuel energy, the maintenance, but we increased the annuity or the investment cost a lot. This system was a lot more expensive to invest in, even when divvied up over the lifetime. This mainly had to do with the investment of batteries and the establishment of charging infrastructure. Going autonomous reduced the operator cost, as you can see here, but also increased the work rate, meaning that the timeliness was at a comparable level for the conventional system. And even if we didn't include soil compaction effects, the costs was comparable over the lifetime of the system. But the investment cost was heavier for the electric system. We also did a study where we looked at local energy storage on farm, meaning that we had the discrete event simulation farm model here, and then we had a separate system or a module where we modeled local production and a battery storage on the farm that served the electric tractors with energy. And here we could see a few things. The first was that production of the energy here was following the sun and the seasons, while the demand for energy for the tractors was quite even during the working period. There was some mismatch both during the day and during the seasons in when you had energy and when you could use it. As we increased the energy storage capacity, we found three different scenarios. One where you go from day to night with the saving of the energy. One where you went from working period to working period. So you save energy during the time the tractors can't work, and then you deliver it when they can. And then season to season. And this is part of the mismatch we talked about. We have most solar energy in the summer, but we have most need of it during the autumn or early spring, when the sun is not as, the solar production is lower. So you could store energy from season to season, from summer to fall, for example. However, it was hard to recommend anything economically over day to night storage, and even that is a bit borderline, because the battery was unused for 96% of the year. It made for very low utilization and low economic feasibility. If you included other uses for the battery storage and the electricity production, it could definitely work, but here it was not enough to have the demand of the tractors. Back at that time, the electricity prices were a bit too low and the battery prices were a bit too high. If we look at the environmental assessment, we can see here the global warming potential, the main climate impact. We have reduced the complexity of the inventory into two different sources. One being the vehicle, which includes the entire life cycle of the vehicle, including maintenance and repair, and also the infrastructure needed. This also includes the end of life, so waste recycling. And then we have the fuel energy, which is only the fuel consumed in the use phase to power the tractor. What we can see is that the fuel is a big part for both scenarios. The different levels here indicate the amount of soil compaction effects. So if we include none of the soil compaction, we get a 61% reduction in global warming potential. If we include all of it, a 74% reduction. But the main takeaway is how impactful fuel is for this kind of machines. And since it was so impactful, we did a separate case analysis of only the fuels, meaning that the fuel we used in the LCA, the Swedish marginal mix here on the side, consisting of 40% natural gas, 35% wind power, and 25% woody biomass, was lower than diesel, even when we mix in HVO. And a lot of the electricity mixes here, you can see, are lower than the diesel case. However, they vary quite a lot. HVO by itself, if we go pure HVO, could have a really low impact, as signified by this diamond, which is the Swedish average feedstock mix. But the interval was quite high, so it was hard to say. And still, a lot of the electricity mixes were still lower. However, the electricity mix chosen was extremely impactful. If you go from using Swedish average electricity mix to electricity from hard coal, you increase the global warming potential 9 times. And at that point, it's a lot worse than just driving on diesel. So this indicates not only that we need to make vehicles electric, we also need a global electricity supply made out of low impact sources as well. So clean electricity would make a cleaner system. And global warming potential was just one climate impact. To get the damage categories, we weighed 18 of them together and made them into damage categories. Here, damage to human health, where you can see that the electric vehicles production, mainly the battery productions, have a big impact. But the total is a reduction from the conventional case. The same trends can be seen in ecosystem impact, the damage on the ecosystem, and resource scarcity, where the electric tractor has a lot more need for mineral resources, but fossil resources like natural gas or oil is a lot more prevalent in the conventional system. In all of these, you can see that fuel is still a major part. And this was true even if we did the weighing into single score points, as you can see here. And even though we found some climate emission impacts where the electric system was worse, especially in production, when weighing all of them together, we get a high probability that it in general has a better environmental impact than the conventional system. So before I conclude, I'd like to present a few of the research suggestions that I didn't have the space to get into, but still feel is interesting and connected. First of all, simulation should be followed up with field tests. I know there are high quality field tests being performed in the research sphere at the moment, but I would like to further encourage these, since that's the way to actually make it, to validate these results. I also would encourage looking at additional production system. We looked at the conventional system here, which might not be the most optimized for electric tractors. Having a no-till or reduced-till system would probably have a better match. It would also be interesting to see how other kinds of grains or crops would look at or be served by this kind of vehicle. Furthermore, further research into alternative fuels is important. Electricity was the focus here, but a lot of the same effects could be reached with autonomous biofuel tractors or hydrogen tractors, for example. And many of the results are still valid, even though we tried to focus on electricity. And how to implement autonomy is an important step. We have assumed that it works and it's owned by the farmer, but other business models are equally valid, and they would have an impact on the market implementation and adoption rate of this kind of system. So it's important to have further research on that specific implementation. Okay, so let's summarize and circle back to the research questions I posted in the beginning of the lecture or presentation. I'm too used at lecturing now. So first of all, can simulated battery electric tractors provide comparable work rate to diesel tractors? I would say check. We saw that due to autonomy, they could have a reduced active time demand and an increased work rate compared to conventional tractors. We also saw this presented in my thesis for several different system structures. So the scenario we chose is no unicorn in that regard. Other system structures could show the similar improvements. Can the battery electric tractors reduce the environmental impact from agricultural machinery use in Sweden? Big check on that. We found that over the climate impact and the different damage categories, we could have a 54 to 80% reduction in the various environmental impacts, which is a big reduction in this kind of machinery use. Fuel was the main part to keep in mind here. It was the key factor and the main decider on how good your system was. Using low impact fuels gave a really big reduction. Using high impact fuels gave a worse system. Could they do so by being economically competitive? Yes, we could see that some costs were reduced with electricity, some with autonomy, and the net was a positive, equaling or reducing the annual cost of the electric systems. However, this is a result that has a lot of uncertainty in it, so we can say in general it's comparable. What are the important technology choices, and could they be optimized for Swedish agriculture? We saw that they could be used to great effect in Swedish agriculture, and we saw that battery optimization was important, keeping the lifetime high of the batteries, and having a good balance between battery, charger, and vehicle was an important technology step. We also saw that vehicle weight reduction could have a great effect as well, reducing all the soil compaction effects. Dividing the vehicle weight onto multiple tractors had a good effect. We also saw that the battery exchange system, where you swap batteries, had a big reduction on the major point of non-productive time for the electric system, and reducing one of the main negatives of having an electric system or battery electric system. And furthermore, autonomy was the main driver for most of this benefit. The synergetic effects were there, but it would be hard to have economic feasibility and the improved work rate without having the autonomy. And the rate of autonomy, meaning how much the driver needs to be there, was a very important factor as well. If we have someone who's not in the tractor but still needs to look at the tractor all the time, we lose a lot of the benefits. But if we have a very independent machine, we have good benefits. So, in summary, can electric autonomous tractors replace diesel tractors? In this case, theoretically, yes. And we found that they could do so in a way that is beneficial both for the farmer and the environment. And it's not the biggest step in the grand scheme of things, but it's undoubtedly a step in the right direction that has cascading effects to other industry sectors. And therefore, my conclusion is that it's a step that we should take. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Oscar. So now I would like to invite the opponent coming up to the stage, and I will assist you in arranging the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
Okay, is it on? Sounds that way. Excellent. Very good. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I have watched Mr. Lagnelöv's work as it progressed, and I was a reader before I was ever asked to be an opponent in this context. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I think just to start the discussion, to remember how important this kind of work is in terms of technology adoption and technology change, that it's this kind of work that looks out ahead and hopefully, if it's done right, helps decision makers, whether that's farmers or government regulatory people or industry manufacturers, entrepreneurs, make decisions about what they will do, what kind of machines and technologies that they will produce and how they will produce them and so on. But that's what makes it so important to do it right and to think about how it was done. So my first question to you is about, who do you think, who's the audience here? Not beyond, you know, your colleagues and your academic colleagues and the people who read your research papers. Broadly, who is the audience that you're trying to address, and how will they use, how do you hope that they will use your results?
Thank you, Professor. That's an excellent question. And do you see me if I sit down here, or? Okay, good. And I think it's really important to keep the audience in mind when you do this kind of research, so we don't get stuck in our own little academic bubble that we only publish for our friends and colleagues in the academic sphere. I have tried to make quite wide work that is partly interesting for academics, but also has some use for farmers and decision makers. I would say farmers looking ahead is one of the key audiences, apart from the academic sphere.
Okay. To what extent are industry decision makers and entrepreneurs an important audience? So I know for my own work that I know my work has been debated in the boardroom at John Deere and at CNH, and also by smaller entrepreneurial companies. Do you think your work might be used by industry?
I think if my work sparked discussion at John Deere, I could retire and be happy. And I hope it has had some of those effects. I have tried to keep my horizon quite open and simulate many different kinds of vehicles, just to have this data for different kinds of machines. So, for example, the ones that we've seen as prototypes from bigger companies. But I wish I could have had more cooperation with these entrepreneurs. And I am a bit unsure about the how to say, the adoption of these ideas from machine makers. We don't really have many good tractor makers of scale left in Sweden. So hopefully I have, by going around and being on conferences, somewhat influenced the field in Europe at least.
And if those decision makers are at least initially unhappy about your results, and I know for a fact that when my work back in the 90s was discussed at the John Deere board, it wasn't because they were happy about it. Is that a success or a failure?
They did get to discussing it, and now in 2020 they are going full ahead on autonomy. So I would say that you made a lasting impact. But the main idea I have wanted to push through it is that it is possible. If it works well, it can have a lot of advantages. And I want the big machine makers, or the small machine makers as well, to see that this could be a future sector. This is something they should keep their eye on and not just think it's a fad that's going to go away.
So coming back to the farmers, and in the end, in my opinion, it is, as you said, it's the farmers who are making some of the most important decisions, because if they don't buy the machines, then the machinery manufacturers and the whole industry also is affected. So why do farmers look at new technology? Why do they want to adopt or not adopt new tech? What motivates them?
That's a really good question. I would say two different things. First of all is interest. They are by nature very technologically inclined and interested in the new technology that might give them an edge or some new toy, maybe. But most of all, I think it's a survival mechanic almost, that they are keeping their eye on what could make them money, or how they could further effectivize their production. Because for farmers, it's all about reliability and economic feasibility. I previously did an interview with farmers asking what was important in this kind of alternative tractor for them. And I listed reliability as one of the options. And everyone chose that as the top one and almost laughed at me that I had other options. So they told me that you can make the best tractor in the world, but if I can't rely on the brand and know that I can have a repairman out here when it breaks very quickly, I'm not going to buy it. So I think they're interested in technology from several perspectives. And as you say, they are a really important factor because they make the market.
Okay. If you had to rank them, the motivations, and what do you think makes the decision, the biggest part of the decision? So I'm going to go with this technology or this machinery system rather than another one. What's the biggest element there?
Right. I want to preface this with saying that I grew up on the countryside, so I have families that farm. But I think having the right color or the right brand that you trust is an important factor. But the main factor would be, is it economically viable? Does it make my bottom line?
Okay. So in my own work, I've found that profitability, benefits to farmers are the most important long run. And in the short run, there's lots of little decisions that are, like what color it is and so on. But in the long run, it's the profitability, and often it's economics, but it might be other benefits, more flexible work time and so on and so forth. And let's get down, think about your thesis. In your thesis, you don't talk about profits a lot. Early on, one of your earlier papers, before the ones you mentioned here, the one in the Journal of Agricultural Science and Technology, talked a little bit about cost minimization, which gets toward profitability a little bit. If profits are what drives farmers, why didn't you have that in the thesis?
I would say a lack of scope and a lack of knowledge. I am an energy engineer by training, so I don't know that much about economics, but it is definitely an interesting factor to delve deeper into, because as you say, it is a driving factor for farmers. We try to touch upon it with the costs of different factors, and I know that doesn't translate directly into profit, but we try to keep an eye on how the farmers could reduce their costs with this kind of system.
Yeah, and just as an aside, in my experience, engineers often learn economics very quickly because in the end it's all mathematics, and so we think about it in a little bit different ways, but there's some basic similarities that it's often harder with biological scientists who are used to thinking about the world in different ways. One of the important issues in technology, and particularly in machine systems, is planning horizon. That machines tend to stay around a long time. That one of the useful ideas of understanding tractors over their lifespan is a half-life. At least in the United States, the half-life of the typical tractor is 9 years. So the half of its lifetime use occurs in the first 9 years, And then they're used decades and decades beyond that.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking of these electric tractors, what's the planning horizon? How long are you looking ahead?
I think you bring up a very important point, and I'm going to take a little bit aside here. It's the similar amount of time in Sweden or in Europe, and this is a problem that tractors they get sold or they get relegated to other duties. Like your main field machine becomes a reserve machine a few years down the line,
Mm-hmm.
and then it becomes the machine that kids learn to drive in.
Mm-hmm.
So they never really get scrapped. They just get put on the bench, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a problem because these electric machines wouldn't work the same way. Since they're more specialized, I think they would be aiming for this primary field tractor spot. But the main thing that we saw aging was basically the batteries, that they have a fixed lifetime, while the machine itself could be used for longer.
But the batteries could be replaced
Yes, of course.
more easily than some of the engine components.
Yes.
Okay. Another key decision in looking at these is where do you look in the adoption path? So do you look at just changing whatever it is you're changing? So swapping out diesel for electricity as a power source. But often when you introduce a new technology, it has a ripple effect. And let's just take the example of when motorized mechanization was introduced in the United States, the cropping system switched from one in which there were large areas of forage crops, of broadacre cereals, to becoming almost like, if you look in the US Midwest, it's almost entirely row crops. And that didn't happen entirely because of motorized mechanization, but motorized mechanization really enabled that to happen. And my suspicion is if you introduce autonomous electric equipment, there will be other ripples. Where do you look in that trajectory?
Yeah, I would agree. Especially the autonomous tractors would be a disruptive technology that changes the game a little bit. It would make it possible to have more direct precision farming. It would allow us to go from, as you say, row crops to a precision that would be resolution of like maybe one plant instead of one row. So it would change a lot of those things as well. And it would also make it so that the farmer would not necessarily be in the tractor driving in the same way. He would be more of a manager or have a more overseer role of his operation. And that might be a hard sell since farmers generally like driving tractors.
So we call that recreational tillage in the US.
Exactly. So we have assumed that that's still going to have a place, but that instead of getting the secondary tractor or the secondary farmhand, you could have a robotized or autonomous system. But yeah, I would definitely see ripple effects of all of this, including further electrification, like we talked about with having the production on site instead of having imported fuel.
Okay.
So I see some ripple effects on it.
Okay. But in choosing, I think, if I understand the thesis right, you have chosen to focus on just swapping out the power source and leaving everything else in its conventional way. And okay, if we go back to when motorized mechanization came in, yeah, initially what farmers wanted was just something to replace the horse. And they used often the same implements and so on. But over time, that changed. Okay, do you think that would have a major impact on what you on what your conclusions have been? And so let's make it concrete. There are proposals out there to go beyond no-till and just do punch planting, where you just poke holes and you put seeds in them. And this requires very little draft. And so the power requirements are greatly diminished from conventional systems. Would a change like that matter in what your results?
I think it really would. That's why I also suggested that other cropping systems like these less demanding ones would be interesting to keep researching. Because then you have, you don't need one of the main weaknesses of the electric system. You don't need to carry that much energy with you if you don't have to do as heavy a work. So punch planting, for example, would be a great benefit. But our philosophy was basically to take a scenario or a system we were very familiar with, in this case, traditional conventional farming, and see how this kind of tractor system would be able to handle it. We could have optimized the entire system around the electric tractor, just to see if we want to make this work as best as it possibly can, how would we do it? What kind of implements would we have? What kind of scheduling would we have? What kind of cropping system would be possible? But instead we constructed a scenario and then just plopped down our machine in it with the thought that if it can handle this, everything or a lot of other things would be easier, meaning that this is sort of a trial by fire a little bit.
So you're pointing at a very early spot in the transition. You know, so if you think of this as a path between, okay, we have conventional motorized mechanization with mainly diesel power to a different future with other power sources. You're looking at a fairly early period in the transition.
Yes, we have set our time horizon to near future. That is also why all the components we're using is based on today's technology. And we haven't really included this future projection and future improvement of some components. So we are looking a few years ahead, but not when this system is the norm, so to speak.
Okay. So you have looked mainly at the earlier portions of the crop production cycle. So soil preparation, planting, weed control. A big part of the power use is at the other end of the spectrum. Why did you omit the harvest part?
Well, mainly because we didn't think that the electric system was powerful enough. We have the harvesting, which is often quite time critical, and you want to be able to harvest as much as possible in a very short amount of time, which means you need a lot of power delivered over a quite extended period of time. And we didn't think that with current technology that we could do that with the system we're proposing.
Okay.
In future studies, that could definitely be an option. But yeah, it was an unnecessary, it was a complication that we wanted to shy away a little bit from.
So the discussion that I've heard about using electrical power for harvest means that you'd probably have to change the harvest system quite considerably because you don't have mobile power.
Yeah.
But over most of history, threshing wasn't done on the go. Threshing was a stationary activity that was done, you know, at the farmstead mostly. And there are, you know, ideas out there about doing that with electrical power. Would that be a possibility? Could you do the same sort of thing that you looked at some of these alternative harvesting systems?
I would say theoretically, yes. The main point would be, would it be economically feasible to do it? Could we reach a good level of efficiency in it? We could also go back a little bit to tractor pull harvesters, which could technically be used. But the system of combined harvesters today are so ingrained in the market and the sector that I think it would be hard to shift. That's one of the problems with it. But technically, I think we could go back to that kind of system, but it would be difficult to make it profitable.
Okay, and that's a hypothesis. So again, going back to that earlier study in the Journal of Agricultural Science and Technology, you did a little bit of optimization there. You looked at some different horsepower levels of tractors and so on. But in later studies, you've done mainly simulation. It's you plug in the technology and you watch it go through the system without optimization. But human beings typically optimize to some extent. They don't absolutely follow their habits.
No, that's true.
Over time, in the short run, yeah, they'll do what they did yesterday. But you give them a little time, and they usually figure out a way to use whatever new capacity. And so when you're thinking about doing these kinds of feasibility analysis, how much optimization should we be doing?
That's a good question. Some, I would say. It's hard to put a value on it. But in this case, it was also a question of complexity. In the study you mentioned, which me and Jonas Engström here in the audience did, we had a linear programming that was easier to optimize. This system is a little bit harder to get exactly optimized. So we had to do it in a more manual way of choosing a fitting system more than a completely optimized system. And it is hard to say exactly how much we should optimize. Models have by their nature some error towards reality, which means that if we optimize something in a model, it might not be exactly the right system in real life when we field test. So we also always have to be aware of that error margin. So that makes it a little bit complicated. It also complicates that the kind of system we're looking at here is a little bit more specified to the farm it's on than a tractor today would be. Conventional tractors are very flexible and can usually be one size fits all, a little bit more than this system can. This system needed to have a balanced approach in the field or in the farm it was working at.
Okay, why would this be more specific to the farm it's on? Because if you think about, autonomy in general. So my hypothesis is that in most of agriculture, we're going to come up with some kind of autonomous system with generally used platforms on which the specific farm will then attach its implements or whatever is needed. And from a manufacturing standpoint, this makes a lot of sense because you can mass produce that generic platform like you mass produce a small tractor, for instance, in millions. And that really brings down the cost. And do you think that will happen or could happen in electric farm equipment?
I think it needs to happen for it to take some of the market share. I think you need that economy of scale. And I want to point out the difference between the scenario we looked at, which are a bit optimized to the farm it's on, and the technology as a whole. If you have a bigger farm, you could, for instance, add a tractor and the system would work equally well. It's just that our solution for this farm would not necessarily work on other farms. But I think the general technology and system, and as you say, the implement carriers, would be more general.
Okay. But mostly, one of the nice things about the swarm robot idea is that expansion is mostly a linear process. You just add extra units.
Yeah, more machines.
Yeah. And there's less lumpiness involved. So why wouldn't the solution that you've come up with work for a bigger or smaller farm?
If we make a thought experiment of having a farm, we had 200 hectares here, and then we double the farm, we had 2 more tractors, but then we would run into problems with the battery charging system, because then we would have twice as many batteries to charge in roughly the same time. which means that we need to oversize the charger a bit to avoid the queues. So I think you would run into some limitations either in the work rate, the battery charging, or the amount of available batteries. So there are more factors than for a conventional system that you could run into bottlenecks with.
And those systems aren't essentially linear as well. You just add another charger.
Yeah, generally it would be as linear, that you could just add more of the components. So theoretically, yes, they could be increased linearly.
Okay.
And maybe easier than conventional system, since the investment cost of a new tractor or a second tractor is quite high. But if the machine itself is cheaper, it could be a less drastic investment.
Okay. So let's think a little bit about the farm you have focused on. Tell me a little bit about how this would compare to a typical Swedish farm.
We chose this scenario because it is representative of a farm you would find in this region of Sweden. We have seen that the farms have become fewer and bigger, so the average size is increasing. But this would still be quite a representative farm of grain production in Sweden. Maybe a little bit on the small side, but not uncommon.
Okay, so would 200 hectares of grain only be a livelihood for a farmer? Could they depend on that for most of their income, or is this, aside, because in the United States, 200 hectares would be a part-time. This would be something that somebody did on their weekends.
Yeah, I think it would be on the smaller side, as I said. I think if you want to make a livelihood of only grain, you would probably want a few more hectares.
Okay. And so if there were other enterprises, if there was some livestock, or if there was some vegetable or fruit growing, or whatever else, that changes the situation. But grain only, it would be relatively small. One of the things that also struck me is your crop rotation is all cereals. And so everywhere else in the world, you usually want a break crop of something that's non-cereal. And in the United States, it's usually soybeans.
Yeah.
In Britain, it might be oilseed rape or linseed or field beans, but there's none in yours.
No, there's not.
And is that common in Sweden?
There are farms that will just grow winter wheat for years on end. But I think it's common on farms to have the break crop. But the way we set up the simulation, we have the years are discrete and independent. Nothing carries over between years, except battery cycles, because we wanted to track that. So basically, you can think of it as it's the same year repeating with different weather. So we're not tracking in between.
So you have no rotational effect in
No.
your. So it doesn't matter whether the previous crop was, we have wheat this year and barley last year, and you don't have field beans or oilseed rape. Ah, okay.
No, and that was a choice we made based on the computations. It would introduce additional effects to have this. So we basically had one discrete year that we then had different weather for. And then when we included battery aging, we also needed some continuous effect over several years. So that's tracked, but for all other intents and purposes, it's a freestanding year, so to speak.
Okay, so yield effects from rotation, which can be quite large, can be on the order of 10, 20, 30%.
Yeah.
Yield increases, depending on what the previous crop was, are missing here.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
So average yields for Swedish agriculture was used.
Okay. One of the other questions, and this delves a little more specifically in the economics, is do you think that this kind of analysis is better done in real terms, correcting for inflation, or in nominal terms with the inflation effects as they are?
It's difficult to say. I feel I lack the economic education to make that separation. In this study, we have included a general inflation. So we have adjusted for 2% inflation yearly, which at the time was a sensible value. Today, it's not. So.
Okay, so the only place that I found in your calculations that you're actually using real terms is in the opportunity cost of capital.
Yep.
How would you estimate real cost of capital?
Also difficult to say in this kind of, since I'm not an economist. So I fell back on using established economic models.
Okay. So typically almost all adjustments for inflation are done using the Fisher equation, which is the simplest form of it is the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation, which is an oversimplification, but for low rates of inflation, it's pretty close, okay? If you take the whole Fisher equation, you can boil it down to an equation that's similar to one of the ones you have in your paper, but if I remember right, it's inflation plus it's the nominal interest rate plus what you have in the paper is plus the inflation rate divided by 1 plus the inflation rate.
It sounds familiar, yes.
Okay. The Fisher equation would say there has to be a negative, a minus in that top. It has to be the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. And you come out with somewhat different number, even at the low inflation and interest rates that we have here. Did you use it as it's stated in the paper, or were your calculations actually using the Fisher equation?
I am quite certain I used it as stated in the paper, which was based on 2 different sources that had the same equation. And since neither my supervisors or my reviewers mentioned upon it, I didn't see the potential fault in it.
Okay, so if you calculate it out for the numbers that you used, so with an interest rate of 2.75 or something, I think, and then an inflation rate of 2%. The difference is the Fisher equation would say the real interest rate is about 0.75. And your equation says it's 5, which is an order of, 5 times difference, which might make a difference in your cost. It makes a difference in your cost of capital and so on. So this is an area that you should look at considerably more closely, and particularly as interest rates rise, as at an interest rate of 2.75, which is just historically incredibly low.
Yes, that might be.
Yeah, and in a lot of developing world economies, you get interest rates that are more like 20% or 30%.
Yeah.
This kind of
and that's a hidden benefit of having the Swedish system.
Yeah.
Because I tried to call the Swedish bank and said, Posture, I'm a farmer with 200 hectares looking to buy a tractor. What interest rate could you give me? And they gave me a range. I picked one of the higher interest rates from there. Yeah. If I had 20%, I would definitely had a different calculation. And in the future, I will make sure to use the correct Fisher equation for my calculations.
Yeah. But the broader question there is, does it even make sense at that point, since at least as far as I can tell, that's the only inflation calculation correction that's made in the whole economic system. Does that make sense to allow for inflation only there and not in other parts of your calculation, or would it be better just to do everything in nominal terms?
Maybe it would be better to make it in nominal terms, so you don't have that degree of uncertainty there, because a lot of the moving costs have turned out to be very wrong just a few years in. Like I had a quite low diesel price and electricity price. I've always tried to use at least 5-year averages, which might make sense from an academic standpoint, but then you look at what's happened the last 1.5 years, which drives up the average a lot. And if you take that number, it would be a really high price. And the same for the interest rate in Sweden and the inflation. So a lot of these numbers I have chosen have become quite unmodern quite fast.
Yeah.
So maybe it's easier to make it more nominal.
And from the economic standpoint, the basic advice would be either you do it all in nominal terms or you do it all in inflation corrected terms, but you don't mix the two.
That's true.
Yeah.
We had some, yeah.
Either one, if you do it consistently, either one will give you as good an answer as you can get. And recognizing that forecasting is incredibly difficult problem, but either one will give you a good answer, but keeping them separate.
Yes.
Another issue, and this has become a big issue in autonomous equipment, is a question of human supervision.
Yes.
And so you made some assumptions about autonomous human supervision of autonomous equipment. And one that caught my eye in particular, and we can talk about the other ones, but the one that caught my eye was 30% for road transport. Why isn't it 100%? And are autonomous farm machines allowed on Swedish roads?
Right now, they're not. They're technically not allowed on fields either. If you're not a researcher or have a special permit, if I am correct in that assumption. But we have placed this in the near future where either farmers could get an exemption or where the legality would have been changed. Because today it is quite restrictive. So we based that number solely upon the perceived complexity of the task, where we assumed that it would need supervision some part of the time, but probably not all of the time. If we can make vehicle or cars today that can drive on highways unassisted, making a vehicle that could drive on roads a lot slower should be feasible. But as you say, in the beginning stages of adaptation, it would definitely be 100%. That would be one of the most complex parts of operation.
Okay. So this is a place where you assume that the environment would change.
The legal environment, yes.
Yes. Other researchers, and in my group in particular, but others as well, have looked at this and said, well, it's going to take a while before autonomous vehicles are allowed on our roads. Probably longer than most of the media would lead us to believe. And as a consequence, road transport has become one of the big constraints in autonomous equipment in places like Europe, where you almost are obliged to go on a public road to the next, so it's relatively unusual that the next field would be contiguous and you wouldn't have to cross a public road.
Yes, that's definitely.
Is that in Sweden? Is that the case as well?
Oh yeah, it's definitely the exception, especially since big farms today are usually, I forgot the English word, arrendera. They have rented the land from other farmers. Mm-hmm. So they usually have quite a spread out areal. Yeah. So it's definitely that part.
Yeah.
And it is a constraint definitely, where you might have to be present to transport the vehicle out to the field. And yeah, that's...
And so this is particularly a problem with OEM autonomous equipment where there's no seat and there's no steering wheel.
Exactly, because you have to get a truck and roll it up on.
You have to have a trailer, you might have to have a telehandler to put the robot on the trailer.
And at that point, you're sort of losing all the benefits of having it be autonomous.
Yes, exactly. So this is a key.
Yeah. So we made that assumption to see that if this system becomes prevalent, what kind of effect would it have? And we assumed that would include it being able to drive on roads by itself. So we didn't have to do this, that we transport the vehicle by either towing it, having it on a trailer, or tele-steering it. Even though the steering from a distance could probably be the least bad option of the ones mentioned.
Okay.
But it is a constraint in as of today, I agree.
So in Britain, it's legally allowed to have what's called a pedestrian-driven machine, which would be remote control, and the operator then walks alongside.
Yeah, you have to have it in eyesight all the time, right?
You're right. Is that allowed in Sweden?
Yes, I think so. From what I've seen, then it's technically that you're steering it just from a distance.
Yeah. So this is what, for instance, AgroIntelli does with their Roboti.
Yep.
But this only works if the fields are in fairly close distance. You know, if it's across the road, yes, you know, the person can walk behind. If it's 10 kilometers away, it becomes
a problem.
Yes.
And we have seen this because we have a test field for digital infrastructure on agriculture nearby here, where both we at SLU and RISE test some self-driving machines. And there you have that you walk nearby the machine and you have the emergency stop nearby, and you watch it all the time. But then is the question, if that's the system you're locked to, why not just have a cabin and sit inside where it's warm? But it's, of course, part of the development. And hopefully we can get away from having to have it in eyesight or in line of vision all the time.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, for the field work itself, you're assuming 10% human supervision time.
I think we...
At least some of the time.
Yeah, I think we increased it up to 20 in the later.
Well, why did you make that change?
I think we looked at sources and found it to be relevant. I know that several sources, including my previous papers and your paper, conclude that 10% would probably be a good value.
10% assumes that the equipment is operating at a fairly trouble-free way, which happens, you know, and we have enough data from 6 years of production on hands-free farm to say, yes, 10% is certainly possible, but you can have certain operations and certain implements which are more troublesome. How would that affect your calculation?
Yeah, I think we wanted to be on the safe side and not be accused of making it too easy for the autonomous machines. So we probably chose a little bit higher rate for that regard. But ideally, you could work it down to 10%, I think, especially since you actually have tried it at hands-free Hector to see what the real hang-ups and the real problems would be.
So to achieve 10% on an overall farming operations, 10% human supervision, our conclusion is you would need considerable artificial intelligence in problem solving. So right now, our machines are quite dumb. They follow a field path, and I think that's what you've basically assumed as well. Our machines can detect an obstacle,
but then it stops.
But then it stops and waits for the human being to come and solve the problem. to make this practical, we probably need some artificial intelligence that allows, at least in certain simple circumstances, that, okay, a tree branch has fallen into the field, we'll just drive around it and continue, or,
Yeah.
you know, whatever. Do you expect that kind of artificial intelligence to be in the near future?
It is very dangerous to ask an engineer or researcher what they think the future horizon will be, because we will say, yeah, it's here in 5 years, and then 15 years later, it's still not here.
But who else would know?
I don't think anyone knows, really. If you get enough data set, you can probably get a good estimation. But I would say, and it's really difficult to predict the future, as we previously said. But I would say that technically it's not that far away, especially for the simpler operation or the simpler solutions. For example, identifying and driving around the tree branch could be quite near, but having it be very independent probably would take longer. I would say the time horizon of in 10 years, we're probably going to see some interesting things happen.
And do you expect, so right now the EU is coming in with some new regulations that would control use of artificial intelligence. If I understand them correctly, most of agricultural artificial intelligence would be relatively unaffected because we're not, you know, trying to identify human faces and so on and so forth. Do you expect regulation to be a big issue in this kind of artificial intelligence application in agriculture? Obstacle detection and problem solving for autonomy.
I would say that it might be a problem or that there might be some restriction when used for autonomous vehicles, since there's an entire discussion about ethics around there. Mm-hmm. The autonomous or the artificial intelligence by itself, I find it hard to say. It's not my field of expertise, but I would postulate that the law that they would implement would probably be quite sweeping. So it would restrict it in certain ways, but hopefully we can avoid.
Or at least avoid the part that affects the application in agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how likely that is, but that is the hope I'm holding. Since we're mainly doing problem solving and things that easily or more easily could be done by more traditional programming, I think it's not as likely that it gets strictly restricted.
Okay. So the new EU machinery directive that comes into effect in 24 really doesn't deal with that artificial intelligence aspect, as far as I can tell. And so you expect this would be some future legislation or regulation?
Yes. I am very poorly read on the new machinery directive, for which I apologize. It seems like something that sounds very interesting to read and that I will get on. But I'm not sure exactly how they worded it there.
Okay. Okay.
Excuse me, but maybe we could take a leg stretcher now.
Would now be a good time?
If you think so. Or
okay,
if you like to.
So I do have a couple more questions, if you're still patient enough to listen here.
Sure.
And,
but it's been so nice flow in the discussion. But now when you just stopped for a while, I took the opportunity.
Okay.
So I would suggest that we take a leg stretcher and then we'll be back here at 14:45. Okay, we will continue from where we stopped before the break. So please.
So let's pick up on some of the work on recharging. And is it correct that your analysis assumes that the tractor must go back to the farmstead to recharge every time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So let's think a little bit about the alternatives there. One of them, I think, which you mentioned, would be to bring a number of extra batteries out to the field. What are the problems with that kind of approach?
The main problem, I would say, is then you have to have a logistic chain for bringing the batteries out to either each field or to a central point close to the fields. And that would add labor cost, and it would add complexity, because you also need this battery swapping system at the field as well. I've seen some current prototypes that aim to use a shipping container, for example, so that you deliver that system, which contains the swapping equipment and the batteries. In my model, or in this model, we did analyses with different distances to the recharging points.
Mm-hmm.
Here we randomized the fields to be either between 1 and 6 kilometers from the farm center, which can be assumed to be quite a long distance. But we also had a very short distance to see what farm or field side recharging would mean. And it would reduce the time, but since the electric system here still had a better work rate and scheduling than the conventional system, we didn't think it possible or necessary to actually have it on the field side. If you're not allowed to drive on the road, however, then it becomes a much more interesting system.
Mm-hmm.
To have the battery switching station on the field side. And also if you have really big farms, as in the US, for example, it could be a very valid way of handling it. In Sweden, we often have a little bit smaller fields that could be a little bit more distant from each other. So then it becomes a different dynamic of it. I think the main thing would be the problem of getting the batteries there in an effective way. It's once again, if you have a vehicle that drives by itself, but you need to drive batteries out for it, then you could drive the vehicle itself almost. We need to keep an eye on what are the benefits we wish to reach with these kind of systems and not introduce new problems to it.
Okay. One of the other alternatives would be just to wire up the fields. So you deliver electricity out to each field. And in the US, for instance, it's reasonably common to have grain storage in the field. So you have a bin at the edge of the field which has electrical equipment in it, needs electric hookup, so the farmer arranges for electric hookup in the field. Something similar could be done for recharging. What would be the constraints on that process?
Different ones, but I would say the main one is economics. The cost of it would probably be a little bit higher. You could definitely have a recharge point at an intersection of several fields, I would say. But you need to make it cost effective. And in this, then you have to calculate if it is. And I suspect that you would find it not cost effective to just put out a charging point. If you do have some other electric equipment out there, like a grain storage, it could probably be a very valid thing to actually have a charger nearby. But to dig down wires big enough to handle that kind of currents, that would probably be quite a cost, even if the farmer would dig the ditches themselves. Okay. So I think it would solve a problem, but I'm not entirely sure that the problem needs solving for the system we're looking at.
Okay. So if a government decided, for whatever reasons, that electrification of farm equipment was the way that they wanted to pursue their environmental policy, would laying those electric lines to each field be potentially a cost-effective way of encouraging that?
For the farmers, I think definitely if they could get some additional help with that. If it's a effective use of tax money, I think it wouldn't be. I think it would be quite a lot of investment for quite little payoff. Because I think if we compare agriculture to mining machinery, for example, both are heavy non-road machinery that works in a specific setting. You can find a lot of the electrification really interesting for mining machinery because they work so much. They have such a constant production. They work almost every day of the year. Farm equipment, for example, instead of working 8,000 hours per year, like a mining machine would, they might work 800 hours per year, meaning that you have a lot less hours to work back the cost. So I think you would have to be very committed to using the charge point on the field if it's going to be cost effective.
But is another important difference between agriculture and mining is the mining tends to be more geographically concentrated, you know, so that an open pit mine of whatever iron ore or whatever might be a square kilometer or something like that. Whereas I don't know in Sweden, but in the US, it's quite common for farmers to have fields within a 50-kilometer radius.
Definitely.
For larger farms.
Or in Sweden, it's probably a little bit less. But if you go to the north of Sweden, it could probably reach those levels.
Yeah, so it's much more geographically spread, which means that the wiring would be more expensive process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So several times and this is really my last area of questioning, several times in your presentation and as well as in the papers you mentioned that one important next step is to do field testing. So what would that field test look like? That if you were in charge of writing the proposal to the EU Commission or whoever's going to, you know, or the Swedish Energy Department or whoever is going to fund this, what would that proposal look like?
Ideally, I would like to test the system we described here with a combination of technologies, because I've seen a lot of testing of electric vehicles in different settings and autonomous vehicles in different settings. But I've yet to see this combined technology, including the infrastructure, being tested. And that's what I'm hoping to see more tests of. So I would basically try to test the different components and then the combination. Can we make the battery swapping work at a reasonable rate and at a predictable or potential cost benefit? And can we combine electric and autonomous in the way that I and others have predicted?
And would you, what kind of scale would this test be? So at Harper, we've discovered there's quite a bit of difference between doing a 1 hectare autonomous field and even 35 hectares, which isn't a full farm, but it's, you know, it's closer.
It's getting there.
Yeah, it's getting there. So in your case, how much, what kind of scale would be needed to give it a good test?
That's also really difficult to say. I would say so that you at least have a good amount of hectares and divided into several fields. So you could see that dynamic as well. I don't think you need the full 200, even though field test in everyday use would be the dream further along. But I would say that you need a few hectares, probably divided in some different fields, so you can see that interaction. But I think the people performing the field test probably have a better idea of the interval than I do. I'd like to see it further along in the time. I'd like to see it in everyday use, that you have a farmer that's actually using it for their everyday production.
Okay, and we'll get to that. Would, in this field test, would you focus on using electrical equipment that's now coming on the market, because there are at least a couple of companies that are offering battery electric tractors, or would you need something that was developed as a prototype for the test?
If you can find something that well enough fit your parameters, I think you could use off-the-shelf products or prototypes already existing. But I know, for example, that when RISE did a field test of this, they elected to build their own machinery. And the field test we've done in SLU is similar, that we've decided to put together our own prototypes. So I'd like it to be possible to take other prototypes, but I don't know if there exists good enough from what I know today. So probably build something.
Okay. So Monarch, for instance, offers a tractor. I presume you've looked at some of their equipment, at least online. And
yes.
Does that look like it fits your?
Well, Monarch is doing mostly smaller tractors for specialty crops, right? Vineyards
is the current application.
So there you have a little bit of a difference, but theoretically, yes. I'm not sure if they are compatible with battery exchange systems, but that could probably be arranged.
Mm-hmm. They're working on it.
Yeah. And if we are, it's always interesting to see these kind of field tests. And I think that a cooperation between universities, institutes, and industries in the sector is going to be really interesting. We have Northvolt that's centered here in Sweden that has done a lot of research on different applications of vehicle batteries. So cooperation with them and universities, for example, could lead to a really good outcome, I think.
Okay.
Or Monarch, as you suggest.
And there are other companies as well.
Of course, we're not singling anyone out.
So does SLU have a history of doing on-farm trials of technology? Because this has been in many cases, a very effective way to identify promising technology and put them in the hands of people who actually, have work to do and want to get things done. And would electrical equipment fit that kind of a model?
I think so. We currently have some projects on that, and we are also very close to RISE and their digital test field out here. And we're also having some grant proposals. Mm-hmm. And historically, we have done a lot of testing, but we have been more theoretical in the recent years. But I definitely think that SLU could be a good home for these kind of tests.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this discussion. I think the examining committee has some questions now, and thank you, the audience, for your patience in this process.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a nice opponentship. So now the word will go to the evaluation committee, and maybe you can pass on this microphone between yourself here in the front row, and let's start here maybe, okay. And then you can choose in what order you like to do it.
Okay. Is it on? Okay. Okay, so this will be a little bit of a shifted topic. My background is LCA, so I'm going to ask you a few LCA questions in specific. In your studies, you did a comparative consequential LCA. I was wondering if you could just briefly say something about the difference between attributional and consequential LCA and why you chose to do consequential LCA.
The way I think about it is attributional LCA is a little bit more, you take something that's already existing and you divide its emission and environmental impact onto the different results or products of that life cycle, while consequential LCA monitors a change in the system, and then you look at that change. And since we are looking at more of a replacement effect here, replacing a conventional diesel tractor with an electric autonomous tractor. I felt that was one of the more suitable ways to going about it. I hope that sort of gets all the main points.
Okay, yeah. Kind of one of the advantages, I guess, with doing a consequential LCA is that you can omit some of the processes like you mentioned that you had done. There are also other aspects of doing a consequential LCA versus doing an attributional LCA in the modeling. And I was wondering if you can say something about those modeling choices that you have done there. For instance, I saw that you have used marginal electricity rather than average. Did you do any other kind of like changes in the inventory?
Well, we tried to do a detailed inventory where the effects we thought would be the highest was modeled more in detail. So, for example, we did a very detailed inventory of the battery, and we also included the fuel as marginal, which is usually, if we change something in the system, it's more probable that the electricity you use will be something that's from the margin of the electricity production, meaning the more expensive and less environmentally friendly part. But apart from those changes, I'm not sure we did anything out of the ordinary, so to speak.
All right.
But we had to, I'm sorry for interrupting,
No.
But we had to put the limits in quite tight so we didn't get an overwhelming system with too many flows.
And you mentioned the battery inventory, which I'm quite familiar with. That was originally modeled as an attributional LCA. And when you're doing an attributional LCA, you would typically, in the production model, with a combination of recycled and virgin materials, and then you give no credit at the end of life. Well, in a consequential LCA, you would typically model it with only primary materials and then give a credit at the end of life. So I'm wondering, did you then combine the two methods where you have used both virgin and recycled materials in the production and then given a credit in addition?
Short answer is no, we assume that every material was virgin material to fit the consequential LCA. And then we gave credit as negative material use at the end of life.
Yes, okay.
And the batteries were, first of all, used as attributional LCA for the stationary battery system. But they used the sources from electric vehicle batteries. Yeah. So we have sort of gone full circle in going back to electric vehicle batteries.
Yes. Another question I have about the battery inventory is that original study was published in 2014. So the inventory is actually from 3 years before that. So that's more than 10 years ago. Do you see any implications or limitations with respect to using that battery inventory today to model up-and-coming technologies?
Yes, I would suspect.
Leading question.
Yeah, I would suspect that it includes some uncertainty and some mismatch with how production looks today, and it's a good debate whether that level of detail is worth the time horizon that passes between. Because I think you could probably answer this really well. I think that production today is more streamlined and probably more efficient than it was more than 10 years ago, which is probably one of the reasons we saw this price drop, which was economy of scale and change of material use, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Mass production has been a big factor there. And so we've seen, for instance, that the energy use has gone down quite a bit. So when I'm looking at battery inventories today, the energy use is about 1/4 of what it was in that study. So quite a drastic change.
So you're saying my results might be even better?
You might. Well, there's a little bit of a mix.
Yeah, different.
But it might not represent today's technology is what I wanted to. Yeah, there's some limitations there. And then on to something completely else, or not completely. looked at both mid and endpoint categories, and I was wondering if you have reflected a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of these two perspectives.
Yes, and for the broader audience, midpoint impact or midpoint results are more these impact categories that I chose or that I presented. So global warming potential, eutrophication and such, with the endpoint being these weighed categories. So human health, ecosystem impact and such, if I got that correctly. And I would say that it's really interesting to see where all the point emission comes and where these impacts, how they differ and what kind of emissions you would get in the midpoint. And then weighing them together to get a more easily digestible result in the endpoint. And since this is two quite different systems and two different philosophies, we found it very interesting to take both of them and also not only look at climate impact, as many studies does, but include all of the most common ones from both agriculture and electric vehicle LCAs. So we could see, for example, that, okay, the climate impact looks like this, but the battery is a big part, the fuel is an even bigger part. But if you look at some other impact categories, the battery production is like all of the impact. So I think by using both of them and having all of the categories as results, we get a quite broad perspective. And then you can pick out like climate impact or the damage categories if you want to have like a number to signify the change.
Yeah, good. That I think I have just one kind of like last question, and that is regarding substitution effects, because that's one of the advantages of doing a consequential LCA, is that you can consider the substitution effects. And you've done that with respect to recycling the batteries. You did not consider the reuse of batteries. How do you think that could affect the system? And yeah, do you have some thoughts about the reuse?
I'm so glad you asked. And to bring everyone else up to speed, in the model that or in my results, I show that when you get to 80% of capacity, we recycle or throw the battery away and then buy a new one. But there's a growing market for second use of batteries, where after they have done one cycle in an electric vehicle, they might be used for storage in a house or something else. But we went directly from using them in electric vehicles to recycling them. And I would definitely say that reusing the battery would have an effect and reduce the negative or big impact of battery production by giving more credits as a substitution effect. We have had the philosophy that we didn't want to model the system too good for the electric system, because we want to make sure that we stand on our own legs and not cherry pick the best parts of it for the electric system. So we have done some of these decisions that might seem not unrealistic, but the harshest solution, just to make sure that even with all these assumptions, the system could stand for itself. And this is one of those decisions that we didn't want to include second life or reuse of batteries.
Okay, thank you. That was all my questions.
Thank you so much.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the enormous work you have done on your research and the great presentation and answers to opponent. But there's still some things to discuss. Research of doctoral level is about generalization, but one of the main conclusions you made is about that 100 kilowatt hours battery could be enough to work on a farm of 200 hectares. Can this conclusion be scaled, and how?
That's a really good question. And when you're doing models and simulation, you always run into the trade-off between specificity and generalization. If you want it to be as detailed as possible, you lose general appeal. And if it's very general, it might be general to the point of not being useful. And we've struggled with this quite a bit. And as you say, we found out that for a grain farm of 200 hectares using batteries of 100 kilowatt hours, this was suitable. But I also hope that we found some of the more general results, that going with an electric and autonomous combined system gives good combinatory effects, or that you need to balance the system as a system and not as components. And I hope that a few of the results are also useful in non-agricultural sectors, where the similar costs or the similar restraints apply. So I hope I provided both general and specific results.
Thanks. Second question is about hybrid power sources. I was wondering, why did you completely omit it in your work?
I have a good answer and a realistic answer. The realistic answer is it was not part of our funding. The more interestingly academic part is that we saw more potential in a pure electric driveline or a pure combustion engine driveline. One of the things you need for a hybrid driveline to be interesting is either change in motor modes or a lot of changes in speed, like acceleration or deceleration. And in agriculture, you have a lot of driving at the same motor mode or having quite a constant power usage. You don't really have these recharging points for hybrid drivelines that would make it really profitable, because you always have to weigh the fuel savings against the additional components you install and the additional driveline parts or powertrain parts. So that was one of the main considerations. It has been done previously, and we found it had less potential.
But a diesel generator, even small diesel generator, could be easily used just a range extender and as additional energy source. And moreover, hybrid power is actually in a lot of use in, for example, in carrier vehicles, in large vehicles. Okay, and then next question. You said that in one of your papers that it is possible to buy a 50 kilowatt autonomous electrical tractor with 2 battery packs included, 100 kilowatt hours each, for about 70,000 euros, as I remember. But it means that the tractor itself will cost only 12,000 euros. Is it realistic evaluation? Because a conventional tractor of 50 kilowatts is as less as 2 times more expensive.
Yes, those numbers doesn't sound very realistic. I think, are you sure it's included with the batteries, with the investment costs?
Battery investment costs, you showed 14,000 euros for one battery pack. And actually, it is not also coming well with other your sources where, for example, in one of your articles, you mentioned about 200 euros for 1 kilowatt hour.
Yes. All of the component costs have been verified against other sources. For example, the tractors have been checked with retail prices from Swedish retailers. And the batteries, we took some market prices that were average on a little bit the higher end of the average from a few years back. So we have tried to not underestimate the price too much, but that price sounds quite low, I would say.
Yes, I think so.
But we've tried to validate all the component costs against other sources, because today you can't buy this kind of tractor on the market, so it's hard to validate that cost.
Okay, and there's also a question about conclusion in your renewable energy article. It was article number 3. In one of the conclusions, you mentioned that there is not a lot of difference between stationary positioned PV panels and two-axis tracking system. But in other sources, it is mentioned that it is about 30 to 40% increase in energy yield for tracking systems, especially for two-axis.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of increase. What we saw mostly when we simulated it in PVGIS, which was the system we used, was that it more moved the peak. So the peak was higher, but if you say so, I would be happy to look at those sources since that paper is not published yet. So then it sounds like it could be an interesting read. I'm also the second author on that paper, so I haven't written the solar production part. But I would love to look at those sources, yes.
Okay, and I think the last question during the discussion with opponent, you touched the problem of reliability. Why did you not include it in your research, for example, of some breakdown probability, which could drastically increase necessary of human supervision?
Yes, we actually played around with that, and in the model there is an option for doing that. Since it was based on random chance, we decided against using it in the later articles, but in Article 2, I think it's included. And then we both had the breakdown rate being higher for this new and more untested system. So that had about 4 times as big breakdown rate. And we also included conventional rate for breakdown rate for the conventional system based on the agricultural or American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers empirical numbers. So we tried to include that, but it didn't have that big of an effect. And to make a more the system less random, we removed it in later articles. But we have included it and we have evaluated it.
Okay, thanks then.
Thank you.
So thanks for a nice discussion and a nice thesis and presentation. So I think I should use this opportunity to learn a little about tractors. So is there, I mean, you went to from a large one to 2 smaller ones, but is there a minimum size of a tractor when it's not useful anymore when it comes to weight or power or so on? I mean, the question is related to why has 2, why not 20 or 200 of them? Could that do the same service?
I'm going to give the very academic response of it depends. And yes, for a general implement carrier like this kind of tractors we're simulating here, you want a minimum weight to be able to provide the draft force to move forward and pull your implement and do like the minimum amount of work. But if you have specialized machines, you could have them be really small and really specialized. For example, we talked about swarm robotics previously, me and the professor here. And there you have, for example, instead of 2 of these tractors doing sowing, you could have 15 or 20 very small machines, each sowing 1 row. So theoretically, no, you don't have a minimum size if you have specialized or adapted operations. But as we did a general operation implement carrier, we needed some minimum weight.
So what I'm getting at is that does it mean that you already by making this choice have decided a lot of the results?
Yes, in a way we have. The results are very dependent on the scenario we choose, and it's a wide field with a lot of possibilities and pathways to explore. So by choosing this more general tractor as we know them today and have it be used or have it use a conventional cropping system, we decide a lot of the factors. And having the same thing being done on smaller machines or other crops could give a totally different result. Definitely.
And I guess you haven't done those calculations, but could you just speculate what could be the consequences of?
Speculation without calculation is always riskful.
Even calculations might be wrong, as you state in your thesis, right? So
true. But I would think that gives a different type of result, where instead of buying separate implements for your carrier or your tractor, you would buy the entire system with batteries, motors, and everything. So instead of buying a sewing machine, you buy 5 sewing robots instead. So I think it would sort of transform the way we see those operations a little bit. But then you have the problem that if you have a tractor, you can hook on every implement. But if you have these specialized machines, they only do sewing. So it might be more interesting for a machine station or one farmer to have a lot of sewing robots and then hire them out to their neighbors when they need to do sewing. So it's a different state of mind or a different business plan, I guess.
Then a bit more of a detailed question around your charging. So you decide to charge your battery from 20% to 100%, but going from the 80% to the 100%, you spend a lot of time. I don't know, maybe half of the time for charging or something like that. Why did you choose that? Why just have 25% larger battery and only go between 20 and 80%, and then you would have only half the time for charging?
That's a good question, and that's a way you could balance it. The nearer you get to 100%, you increase the resistance in the batteries a little bit. So you don't want to go full speed all the way to the top. But as you say, you could have a bigger battery and then just take the difference here. We calculated this in more of a linear approximation way, as you saw in the thesis. But we didn't see really that much queuing in the charging station, meaning we had that extra time. But if it was so that we had less time or more queuing in the battery systems, you could definitely upscale the batteries and use the fastest charging rates.
Yeah, wouldn't it give more hours out on the field? I guess it's not only queuing. No, but, and that's the other thing. You played around with the size of the battery, but you kept the size of the charger independent of it, which means that you roughly, for 1 hour out in the field, you need 1 hour of charging. So having a larger battery doesn't help because it gives you 2 hours out in the field, but 2 hours for charging. So how come you don't size the charger in a different way? So when you have a larger battery, you have a larger charger.
Well, that's one of the things I meant with balancing the system. And we decided against my own recommendations not to do that with the charger, because we introduced this battery changing system, which meant that you had 2 batteries that say you can drive 2 hours on them. But while you're driving with one of them, one is at home charging for the same amount of time that you're driving. So in that case, since you're at maximum using 50 kilowatts in the tractor, you basically will never have the queue of the battery.
No, I agree with the battery swapping. You don't need to charge with higher power, but
exactly.
but you could have gone a little more extreme with even larger batteries, right? And fewer charging.
Absolutely.
And fast charging.
And we did some scenario analysis where we tried this, having bigger chargers and bigger batteries. But then we run into the problem of this charging rate, that you get a higher degradation of the batteries. But if you do them increase them in the same fractions, you keep the charging rate the same. Then it won't be a problem. So that's just one step you could have taken if you didn't want to go for the battery swap, I would say.
Yeah, as long as you, well, at 1C charging, I think it would mean that you're discharging at a slower rate, and likely you also gain some lifetime from doing that. So.
I know we did a very simplified simulation in that we had 3 set charging rates. It's more of a gradual curve, of course, but we wanted to see what like a normal charging rate as 1C can be considered versus a really fast one and a really slow one, and that effect. And then in reality, we would be somewhere in between, of course.
Mm. Yeah, I think you had more freedom than you actually used in your models. But Also, you have some queuing for charging with autonomous vehicles. Can't you program them not to line up for charging? Isn't that one of the advantages?
Yes, theoretically you could. And if you would build this system in real life, I suspect you would program them like that. Here it was just easier to just let them do their thing. And if they ended up queuing, they ended up queuing a little bit. So it's definitely an optimization thing, not in the system, but in the model and in the code. That if I had more time and put more effort into that detail, I could definitely have avoided some of the queuing.
Even I think in paper 2, when you state the cost of energy, there's a misprint there because it's on page 366.
Let me get my book.
Yeah, okay. Sorry to bring up small details here, but
if not now, then when?
You say that the total cost of energy. You add 0.17 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and then on top of the electricity cost, and you have an electricity cost of 0.08 euro per kilowatt hour. It can't be 0.8 kilowatt hour per. It's euro per kilowatt hour. So it seems to be far too high here, the electricity cost.
Yeah, that might be including calculating the battery cycling cost as part of the electricity cost.
Yeah, but that was 0.17 euros per kilowatt hour. Okay. Here you say the
yeah, and if I remember correctly, it should be the electricity should be like 0.0 something, yes. 0.08 or 0.07. So then it's probably not included.
No, yeah, okay. But anyway, what I saw was that a farmer is happy in a way they don't have to pay much tax or any tax on diesel. So the difference in energy cost between diesel and electricity is smaller than for most other users of diesel.
Yes.
So does it mean that it's even harder to convince a farmer to get away from diesel? Is this sort of working against changes in
I would say yes. Of course, if there's a lot of incentives for farmers to use diesel or make diesel use cheaper for them, it's going to be harder to contend with that. And we were actually on the way of removing this tax payback on diesel for farmers. But then the pandemic hit and the prices increased, and then we got the war. So now it's back again. So now it's even harder again. So if I remember, we included the latest tax payback level. So it actually ended up being so that diesel and electricity for a farmer cost the same amount per kilowatt hour before you put it in the machine, which calculation-wise is really nifty, but academically makes it kind of hard to premiere one over the other. We did have the energy savings for the electric.
Yeah, that's the only thing that can actually pay for the extra cost, right?
So the entirety of the fuel cost reduction, was that we had a more efficient powertrain, because the prices that you bought the fuel for was the same for the farmer.
So would you recommend that you put some taxes back on diesel for farmers? Do you dare to do that in this room, or?
Considering my family is here, I don't know, but but I would say that if we want to transition away from diesel, we need to make sure that either the environmental impact of diesel or the tax on diesel is higher, because today it's still quite cheap to drive on diesel compared to the potential cost effect it could have in the long run. So I would say the economic incentive is really strong. So if you make diesel very expensive, there's going to be a real pull for alternative fuels and solutions.
So I know you already said that you're an engineer, so you look at the technical solutions. But so for implementing this, what do you see as the biggest hurdles? Are they the technical problems, or are there other things? So economy, or what is really...
That's a question I could think about for a long time. I would say currently it's the market will and the political will to make this kind of system a reality. Because technically, all these problems could be solved. Cost-wise, they could probably also be solved. But there's a tendency in the market to favor well-known systems that you know provide what you need. And the incentive to try new things is not that high. So I would say some political incentives and some ways of making the market introduction and adaptation easier, I would say. But I am an engineer and I have overfaith in the technological solutions. I think that's going to be less complex to fix, even though, of course, as anyone who has spent some time delving into the details, especially my colleagues here in the room who works with field tests of this, there's a million technical problems to solve as well. But I say that if we got a really strong pull, either politically or from the market, for these kind of systems, I think it would go a lot faster.
And my final question then, do you see any other viable technical solutions where you actually could reduce emissions from farming other than batteries? How about hydrogen fuel cells or other technical solutions? What do you see?
Well, that's one of the benefits of the situation we are in today, that there are many viable solutions. If we go to renewable energy sources, there are several to choose from that would have the same climate effect that I have been describing. Some of them are easier to implement. For example, HVO could be used to replace diesel as we speak, if there was enough supply of it. And so there's a lot of other things you could do. And apart from that, of the 23% of the global greenhouse gas emissions that originates in this sector, along with forestry and other land uses, only 1% is machinery. So we have a lot of things we can do in other sectors as well. Reduce food waste, look at land changes and such. I have a lot of colleagues that does great work in these sectors, and there's a lot of things we can do to get this quarter of the global emissions under control. I'm just doing my percent part here.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, Oscar, thank you very much. I really congratulate you for this nice thesis work and a very clear presentation also, which I really enjoyed it. And actually, you have answered most of my questions during the presentation, and it was very clear. And then I enjoyed also your discussion with the opponent, and thank you very much. And then I have a couple of very general questions. And you know, this autonomous tractor have been introduced some years back, and the implementation and adaptation and rate is very low. And you have listed some of the challenges and also from different accidents, and you combine the synergy of that. But in addition to that, could you say something why autonomous tractor is not implemented at a good rate?
Yes, I would love to. I think the development has been strong, but mostly on the technology development and prototype stage. I feel that today there is something holding the widespread adaptation of autonomous equipment in agriculture back. And I'm not sure I could definitively say what it is. I think it's a combination of several factors. We can have this discussion after with all the experts in the room, but I would say it's part like uncertainty from the users that they can make it work. It hasn't been on the market for that long, which means it's hard to get a good information on how long it lasts, what kind of effects it would have. And I also think the political or legal situation is a problem, that currently the people are a bit unsure if they can actually buy and use this system, or if it's against the law, or if there's some complexity that they're not seeing, if it can drive itself to the field, for example. So I think it's a combination of it being a new technology and it being one that is not, the legal landscape is not quite there yet.
Especially safety factors.
Yes.
Yeah, and then if you come to your thesis, I think you have answered that question. And when I read your objectives and the methodology or like that, and you left the field test. And of course, you simulated, and the approach you followed is very scientific, and the result is very good. But if you had you include the field test for the validation, and do you think it adds value for the thesis?
Yes, I definitely think that adding a field test portion would have put it more firmly with boots in the ground, so to speak. I know there has been a lot of great field tests in the vicinity of this thesis, done both on campus and in the same time as this project has been ongoing. And I think some cooperation between the field tests and this project could have lended it a bit more real world value in that case, because then you could test out these things that I've predicted to become a problem or a benefit and see more if they are or not. And I hope that my conclusions are being tested in that way. And since one of my supervisors is running one of the field tests, I have high confidence that they are. But I would definitely have wanted to do some field tests. But the width of the thesis, looking both at life cycle analysis, battery modeling, economic analysis, agriculture, electricity, autonomy, made it hard to get down to a field test as well. So a different project angled a different way would have different results. So
the methods you have chosen are very complementary. I think which made your thesis a unit body, so which is very good. And the other question is a little bit academic. It is styles like that, but in your specific objectives, you divide the specific objective in subject-wise, and then your papers are completely different. And for example, specific question number 1 includes some paper 1, 2, like that, and like why you choose like that instead of making clear specific objective 1 is paper 1 or like that, for the sake of clarity. But I don't mean that this is bad, but why did you choose this approach?
Well, my specific research objectives was mainly set forth in the grant application that funded my research. So I tried to the best of my ability, answer those in the different papers. And it turns out that a lot of the papers had some correlation between them. So for example, looking at economic factors was present in several papers. So it's basically that a lot of the methods used and the methodology you could find in several papers. So they were more interconnected than one paper answering one question, I would say.
And then just in relation to that, you mentioned the different project funded your work, and that is a research work and project as a whole. And I just wonder if the project has already dominated your ideas also like that, so that you should steered by the project objective, and what was your input, and to make it your own work like that?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and I think it's important as researchers not to be too steered about or from your project side, but also answer the questions you set out to answer. the project funding we received, or I received, was quite wide, and it was already sort of in line with the work I had done previously and which I was interested in. So it matched very well with the kind of answers that I personally would have wanted answered anyway. So the project funding or project descriptions put out the box, and then I could move quite freely within the box. And I never felt constrained.
Yeah, thank you. And then about coming back to this autonomous, and you talked about the efficiency, and also especially in the no limitation of in time aspect, 24/7 or like that, and also using light vehicles advantages on like that. But in terms of efficiency now in agriculture mechanization, the tendency is to use big tractors and then to operate it in a large width at the same time. And this the tractor you have simulated are small in size, and how do you see the efficiency? Is it calculation?
Yes, that's a key question actually. We have seen that the tractors have become bigger and bigger, and if you go to an agricultural fair, you will see that the manufacturers often have almost a competition in like who can produce the biggest tractor. And one of the reasons we have done this is that we have a driver for a certain amount of time, and we want to make sure that the cost of the driver is used as good as possible, meaning that we have bigger and bigger tractors, so we can work a bigger field in the few hours we have the driver. By switching to autonomous vehicles, you get less work done per hour, definitely, but you have more hours to work with.
Yeah.
So you don't have to have, instead of 10 or 8 hours, you have the 24, meaning that even if you have a third of the work rate or work being done per hour, you would still have the same potential daily work rate. So that's how you could increase the efficiency even if you have smaller tractors, that you have multiple tractors that work for a very long time. But in certain cases, no. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. And then I think just a small comment about your discussion with the opponent about the implementation of artificial intelligence in autonomous. I think partially it is already in and especially if it is autonomous, it is assisted by some algorithm and the machine is learning there, and I think it is already there, and that is maybe when it comes to the level number 5 you have mentioned, to that level, maybe that technology could be integrated and implemented. And I think in the future, maybe then in terms of efficiency, in terms of types of operation, and also type of implement, size of implement, that could be some of the activities in the future. And thank you very much once again, and I really enjoyed your thesis and the presentation.
Thank you for your insightful questions, and I agree with your comment, the last one there.
So thank you very much. Is there any follow-up questions or any additions the evaluation committee likes to do? You better speak up now. If not, I'm turning to the audience. If there are any questions, you can raise your hand. I will come with a microphone. You can ask it questions. And regarding those of you joining on the webinar, Anders is sitting here, so he can keep track of any questions, and I will then try to read them. But we will start with questions here in the room. And the first hand I saw was over here.
I can also make a comment. It's okay to ask questions in Swedish. I will translate. Det är okej att fråga på svenska om man vill.
Jag tänkte på i din presentation så pratar du om olika former, alltså att hur man förädlar den här energin. Och jag undrar om du har funderat någonting på restströmmar, att använda sig av andra produktionsföretag, livsmedelsföretag runt omkring som kan hjälpa till att skapa den här energin för att sen kunna, och till exempel skapa samarbeten mellan bönder för att kunna få en mer ekonomisk spin på det här.
Right. So quick translation. Is it okay if I answer in English? The question was if I had considered any waste stream and energy produced from them, and also if it would be possible for farmers to cooperate within that those waste streams to combine them. And we are doing a lot of research on biogas from waste products on our department, and biogas as a tractor fuel has been considered for a long time, and it's also an important part in having an effective waste system. That basically means we can use waste to gain energy, which is always a benefit. So we, as in SLU, have considered it. I, as Oscar, have not in my thesis. But I can point you to at least 4 people in here that could answer it really well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There were some other hands raised. I think one there, and then I will come back to you here.
Hi, Oscar. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation and discussions. You showed in a slide where you had the model, where you had modeled bottom up the tractor, the diesel tractor energy use, I think it was, and then the field trials and what they showed. So, and they were quite different. And I'm just curious to know, why do you think that difference occurred? And then I also am curious to know how you think that your modeling of the electric tractors could change after field trials, or be how they would.
That's a very relevant question, and it hurt a little bit that they differed. I wanted them to be exactly similar, but one of the things was that the equations we used was reported in other sources to have about 15% too high energy use when compared to compared to field tests. And the same equations were used for the electric vehicle as well. So we tried to take account for that by using this field test instead. Not all of the operations that we looked at was included in the literature values or the field test. So we had to approximate a little bit, and in some cases they were just flat out missing. So that might account a little bit for it being lower. Otherwise, it's actually hard to say. There is some variability in this kind of field tests and equations, but by showing both kinds of energy use and also comparing it to literature values from other sources, we try to at least be in the realm of possibility, even though we might not have been able to pinpoint the most realistic value. So it is a problem. We're aware of it, and we try to be as transparent about it as we could.
Right. It was a question here, right? And then we go down there. Good.
Okay, I have one question, sorry, pertaining to the impact categories and the damage categories you'd used in the LCA analysis. And to begin with, I would like to give you enormous cuddles on behalf of the ecological community for not limiting yourself to only global warming. We love it when you do that. Now, when it comes to ecosystem impact, that is usually divided into global warming and habitat destruction and biodiversity loss. And I can see that you've included several parameters that could represent habitat destruction. But I would like to ask, have you considered integrating biodiversity loss and effects thereupon in this analysis?
I find it really interesting that you're discussing this. And thinking about it, it should be included. I have to hide a little bit behind me using a software that does all the weighing together by itself. So I haven't had any possibility to stray too much from the framework of that software. But I think it's limited to what kind of impact categories have these effects. You can see, if you really dig deep into the data, which kind of impact categories are responsible for the ecosystem impact. So for example, eutrophication and acidification, for example, which I think would amount to biodiversity loss.
Excellent.
So we thought about it, but I'm a little bit bound by the framework and the methods I'm using.
Excellent.
So I'm here representing the engineers.
Yes.
So I have two questions, one that is going to be quite easy for you and one that's going to be hard. So the first one is, let's say, congratulations, Oscar, you've been assigned to the Department of Autonomous Tractors, and you get infinite money to implement and get the autonomous tractors implemented in all of Sweden. What would you do? What steps would you take? And the hard question is, what is the difference between a heat exchanger and a heat pump?
Some background on that first question is we studied engineering together, and I had a hard time grasping the difference between these two systems. And I will answer it in the break outside later. The first question, if I had unlimited money and was put in charge of implementing autonomous machinery.
Not infinite, huge, but not infinite.
Okay, countably huge amount. First, I would solve the legality problem, making it legal and have ease of use as a very strong word, so that industries could use it easier. And then I would probably initiate collaboration with the different industries that are represented there, both users and producers of the systems. But mainly, I would probably just get the ball rolling on making it easier to use and legal for those industries that need and want it.
We'll take a question here first. Hi, Oscar. Fantastic presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
And for my question, that's why not go for an autonomous diesel tractor? You get all the power from the diesel, but it's still autonomous and it can work for longer hours.
Yeah, that is a really good question. And one of the shadow results that you can find in my thesis, but not in my presentation, was that the autonomous diesel tractors actually had the lowest cost out of all the scenarios we looked at, because you get all the economic benefits of the autonomous tractors, but none of the negatives of the electric driveline, in that you have low energy carrying capacity. So I think that is the thing that's going to arrive regardless. Like autonomous conventional tractors will definitely come here by their own power. They don't need to be combined with electricity to work, but electricity need a combination with autonomy. And by that same logic, autonomous tractors driven by biofuels would also be a hit, because then you get this emission reduction as well. So if any of you need some grant ideas or a PhD application, that's a good start.
Thank you. I'm wondering about, you mentioned how for the farmers who would be working with this, there's always the interest in new technology and wanting to sort of whatever edge there might be to gain really any positive from it. But also, you want reliable, you want something Where, in your opinion, where should the major push come from to entice farmers the most? Should it come from government? Should it come from industry? Should one aim to get a few of the farmers along and have them sort of enthusiastically speak about it? Sort of where should the push come from?
That's a really interesting question. I would say I would put the ball at the machine manufacturers, because I think when they release a system, they release a vehicle, and then they show it at fairs. Farmers can come and touch it, they can come and see how it works, they can come and try it. They will gain a certain amount of trust, and then some of them buys it and recommends it to their colleagues or neighbors. And the word of mouth is quite strong in this sector, I would say. So I think the big corporations or manufacturers need to make a push, and they need government and regulatory institutions behind them to make that push easier. I would say that's my non-professional opinion in the matter.
Thank you for the very nice presentation. In one of the LCA results, you showed the soil compaction impacts on the diesel tractors, but not on the electric. Do the electric don't have soil compaction impacts?
Also a good question. The way we handle soil compaction is that we went along the line of previous established sources, that a lot of the soil today is already compacted to some degree. And by using heavier and heavier machinery, you make it more compacted, leading to further detrimental effects. And by scaling back the machine weight, you could avoid this further compaction. So that's why you can see on the electric vehicles, we assumed that they were compacting normally, or compacting at the same rate as has been previously, but not furthering the compaction, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Oscar, for a very good presentation and a very nice thesis. Very good work. It's a bit fun that we used to be colleagues and investigated this together. You went the theoretical way, and we went the practical way. So we have a machine that we hopefully can test these results later, probably in the spring. So what would you think would be the changes to your theoretical calculations when we test it practically? Would it be better, worse? What would happen? What will happen?
Yes. Once again, a good question, and thank you for getting me started in this field many years ago. I was also on a podcast quite recently, and as a cover picture, they actually used your machine, so they know that we're close. And to your question, I think if you test this in real life, I think it's going to be a little bit worse for the electric system than I have postulated here. I think that our assumptions that things will sort of work the way we intend them to won't really hold up in reality. I think that there's probably going to be some, the charger's not aligning correctly 10% of the time, or the sensor's not clicking. So there's a lot of complexity that could go wrong until the kinks are hammered out. So I think it's going to be, some of that would probably be included, while I haven't included it. So I am quite not happy, but it's definitely easier to be in the simulation track than on the field test track for that kind of problems. So I would say that it's probably going to be a little bit worse.
Thank you for the presentation, Oscar. I have a quick question. Have you had a chance to calculate or do any estimations of what would be the energy requirements to fully switch Sweden onto electrical agriculture? How much would we need to upscale our electrical energy production?
Not much, I would say. I get some engineering nods here, so maybe I'm on the right track. There has been calculation that switching the entirety of Sweden's transport system to electric would be less than we export every year. So just on a yearly scale, limiting export could power our transformation to electricity. And considering that not that big part of or the majority of the energy use in transport is not in agricultural machinery, I think we wouldn't need to make that many changes to the energy system in Sweden to make it happen. We might have to strengthen the electric grid on the farm side, since often farms are on the sort of lower powered grid and at the end of the line. So we would need to make sure that we have strong enough electric grid out on the countryside.
Thanks, Oscar. Impressive work and presentation and thesis, although I haven't read all of it, but I promise I will. I have a quick question. If we assume that HVO is a secure fuel, and would you still think that the automated option is a better one, keeping in mind that HVO tractor needs no change in infrastructure, practice, etc.? I just wanted to, hear from you.
That's a good question, and one that I have answered before. HVO is a good contender. It definitely is. The problem so far has been to make sure that everyone who wants enough of it has enough of it, because right now it's a problem of supply. We also have this problem that it depends on what kind of feedstock you use for your HVO, which is basically biodiesel. If you use palm oil that makes rainforests get cut down, it has a lot of impact. But if you use it from these waste streams that we talked about previously, it has a very low impact and it's basically a boon to the system. But you can only have that much waste to use. So it's a question of either we have electricity, which is not limitless, but it has a lot of production potential, and it scales quite linearly by itself. Or you have HVO, which is dependent on these feedstocks and their prices, and also how much, if you use waste, how much waste there is in the system, meaning it's coupled to the primary production of those kind of things. So if you have enough HVO, I would say that's a really good first step to just switch over to. But the electric system is more efficient in itself. So I say that's a good end goal, to use the most effective system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to check first, is there any questions coming up? No? Then I will give the word to Cecilia once again.
It encouraged a question or discussion. Yeah, because there is this talk about the biofuels, but you still would be using a combustion engine, which isn't as efficient. So it would be interesting to know, you have the complications with the electric fleet, but it still has a more efficient use of the energy. So is there a problem with it having to drive further that could eat up the benefits of the efficient engine, or why wouldn't you just go electric?
Well, first of all, you have this energy carrying problem that you can carry. Let's say we have 0.1 kilowatt hour carried energy per kilo of battery. If you go with diesel, you have roughly 12, so it's like 120 times more. So it's still a big difference there. But ideally, yes, you would have a very short distance to drive back to refuel, and then the electric system would be very effective. But if you have to drive, as Professor Lowenberg-DeBoer said, this 50-mile or 50-kilometer radius, then you would have a problem, because then most of your battery energy would just be spent driving back and forth between the farm and the field. So if you have really long distances, you either need a bigger battery or alternative fuel, just to make sure that the amount of time or rate of time you spent on field work remains high.
I have the mic again. We're lucky in Sweden to have a clean sort of energy mix. And I think you mentioned something, if you're not to have a Swedish energy mix, probably your emissions would be high. So I think the upscaling of your system is very much connected to the paradigm shift in the energy sector. So how do you think that would be if we to generalize or to introduce this technology in another country with heavily based fossil fuel energy system, etc.? Or do you think there is a connection between the both upscaling, the transition here?
I definitely think there's a connection. And you always have to balance this. Since you have a lot of investment in environmental impacts in the production phase for the electric vehicles, you need to have a gain in the fuel you use. And that gain has to pay off this higher investment. That's when you get a net benefit. And if you use a very dirty emission or electricity mix, then you don't get this benefit at all. So if you took this and put it in other energy systems, the results would look different. The energy system we use now was not the cleanest one imaginable. It was close to the European average mix. But compared to the Swedish mix, it has a lot more impact. So, of course, it's extremely important to switch the electric system to low emission sources. I think both for the electric vehicles, but also for almost any other facet of society. Almost everything we do has some kind of reliance on electricity. So if we switch the electric system to be less impactful or have less emission per energy unit used, we gain a lot over the entire board. So I think if we want large-scale reduction in climate impact, then that is one of the main factors we should be focusing on. I'm beating on my own point that this is an important field of research, but part of it is that a cleaner electricity system would make electric vehicles even better. So that's my answer to that.
Right. Yes, coming.
So on the paper where you coupled the solar production with this system and you had energy storage, most of the battery was unused most of the time. But the tractors are also unused most of the time, and they also have batteries. I'm going to point out the obvious thing. Why aren't you using the I mean, do you see any use cases here? I'm not going to answer the question myself.
Yes, I see several use cases. You could definitely use the batteries in the tractor as local energy storage as well to smooth out the difference between production and demand. You could also have it for storing energy so you can avoid the peak cost hours of the electricity prices. So maybe we go about that system in a different way, where we have the storage to fill up the storage on the tractors. You could combine it into a more utilized system that uses both kinds of batteries for more things on the farm, I think. So there's probably a lot of room for improvement. And I think that using the batteries in electric vehicles would become a more integrated part in running a farm, especially if you have this production on site. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And there is no online questions. So I'm looking over the audience and asking, is there a final question?
I can ask the final question.
You can.
I know what the final question is. What are you going to do now?
I am going to go back to the department and enjoy some drinks and snacks while the committee has a meeting. And then preferably a nap and a party in that order.
Good. Then I think we come to the point where we should end this session. I would like to thank you all. First of all, Oscar, for a nice presentation, standing up for all the questions without any sign of being exhausted. I want to thank the opponent for a very nice discussion, and also the evaluation committee for the following up and expanding the discussion and bringing more aspects. And finally to you in the audience, who has also been very active with questions, which is very nice. And with that said, before ending this session, just a reminder to the evaluation committee and the opponent that we will have a closed meeting up at the department on the 5th floor. So we will have to move there. And there will also be right there where Oscar was talking about the snacks. There will be some snacks outside there where you can wait for the decision who will come then from the room where after the decision has been taken by the evaluation committee. So thank you everybody for a nice afternoon, and I hope that you can join to the department and see that Oscar will, what result will come out. So thank you very much.
Thank you.